I'm Coach Tarek.
And I'm Vanessa.
We are your movement experts, and we are here to educate health and fitness professionals with the tools to create real change for and within the industry. Hey, it's Coach Tarek, co-host of the Purpose Driven Movement podcast. In this episode, I interview Ben Wisbey, a performance scientist who's come up with an incredible product called Pylot, which tests and measures mental performance and getting someone into flow state. So if you're wanting to know when the best time of the day is to work and do your best work, then this piece of technology will help you to do your best work and get into what's called flow state. So they did some whole research around measuring your brainwave activity and your heart rate variability, looked at those two key measures to then determine, for example, when it will be best for you to do your best work. Oftentimes we get stuck in being overproductive. So we really question this in this episode. Instead of this mentality that every minute counts, it's actually about the quality of your output that matters most. So if you're really into mental performance, you're wanting to excel in this space, then tune in to this wonderful conversation with Ben Wisbey. Check out the Functional Training Institute's latest offer, which is 15% off of any of our online training courses. Simply go to functionaltraininginstitute.com and input PDM15 at cart checkout. Today I've got with me Ben Wisbey from Pylot, and we're going to be talking all about productivity, what is it, and how we can really kind of not get so obsessed in and around merely trying to quantify productivity, but how can we really get into flow state, particularly when we're working or when there's high levels of focus that's needed in whatever task you might be undertaking in whichever profession. So it's a very pertinent episode, and we got here Ben. G'day, Ben. Good to have you on.
Good. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to having a chat.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, you and I had a chat beforehand, and I really loved your approach to things. And certainly what we're going to dive in today is about not just the piece of tech that you have around productivity, but really looking at understanding what productivity is. So in this regard, we're going to be looking at how to track your one's mental energy and how to get into this optimal state that some call flow, and all these different gear systems. And a lot of research, Ben, seems to be in and around this concept of productivity. You know, there's productivity gurus. How do you kind of maximize every minute of your walking life, your waking life? And so we're going to really dive into kind of those elements. But before we do so, do you want to give us a little rundown of, who you are, and I suppose how people can get their interest piqued from what you have to say?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an Aussie. I currently live in New Zealand, but my background is as a sports scientist. So pretty much straight out of university, or even while I was at university, I started working with elite athletes and had a real love for endurance sports. So did a lot with triathlon, and then a big block of work as a sports scientist with elite cyclists in Australia. And during that time, I guess my specialty was really monitoring how ready they were to train or compete. And this was quite a while ago now because I'm not young. So we were looking at using heart rate variability about 25 years ago to try and do this monitoring. And that was always my obsession, is can we use technology to monitor athletes to help them get the best out of themselves? So after I finished working with cyclists, I moved into working with professional team sports, and in Australia, that's the Australian rules, or the AFL. That's the big professional sporting industry. In that work, sort of looked at the other side, which was on the load that the athletes went through using GPS. So we were sort of the first people to look at GPS in AFL and worked with a few teams doing that and heart rate variability, and then end up working with the AFL themselves for an 11-year block, whereby we had to look at every single game of from every single player of GPS, which started out as a small job, and 10 years later it was pretty much every player in every game. But I guess that probably sums up my background as a sports scientist. It's really about monitoring players and using data to try and help athletes get the best out of themselves. And I guess that becomes of interest in sort of my current area as well. But the transition into where I am now was I always had this love for sport, but suddenly consumer technology caught up with wearables, and instead of using a $1,000 heart rate monitor to monitor heart rate variability with athletes, suddenly there was cheap off-the-shelf solutions, and my Australian company got bought by a US tech company interested in putting that IP into their wearable. And so spent a few years in the tech/wearable space before finishing up there and setting up Pylot. So it's an interesting background. I call myself a performance scientist, I guess, because of that sports background, but now a bit more of a focus on the mental performance side.
Yeah, that would suggest so. And, and so this whole concept of, quantifying and really understanding data tracking, data, if you have that, it drives performance. From that element, do you see that with such a rise in the consumption of tech and it moving at such a fast pace with the wearable tech in particular and, Apple Watches and so forth, do you see like a conundrum though, where there's just too much dependence and choice, is so vast? Did you want to sort of speak about that, particularly in the space of what Pylot's about, tracking mental energy, for example?
Yeah, so I guess it's interesting, right? Because if I think back to when I first started doing the tracking of athletes 25 years ago, it took so long to get and analyze a 5-minute sample from an athlete that, you basically get a dozen of those and that's your day done. That's like, whereas now it's the complete opposite, right? Where any of us as individuals get so much data that we don't know what to do with, and we can be sort of inundated with it, and it can probably lead us astray a little bit. So I think technology and sensors specifically are a blessing and a curse in that way. So they can definitely give us guidance, but I think nowadays they also give us a lot of noise. And I think we need to be very selective about what data we focus on, what data we find useful, and then how we use that. And I think the common one I hear a lot of is people who use their Apple Watch or any other smartwatch and does sleep tracking, and they wake up feeling fine and have a look at their sleep data and they go, oh, it says I had a bad night. And suddenly it's like they're questioning that maybe they're not feeling fine. And so I think there's a number of these scenarios that even though there's benefit, you can easily be led astray at the same time.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Maybe we should change the adage of data drives decisions to data drives delirium. I think that oftentimes it's like, if you believe you can't, you're kind of right. And so like that example that you gave where someone, could have had a few hours sleep, whatever, they wake up and they're really fresh, they're sharp, etc. But then the tech is suggesting, hey, you've had a bad sleep. And so then it could then change them. And all of a sudden their whole perception and the way that they go about their day might be in a negative state as opposed to kind of that feeling that they had when they woke up.
100%. So when I used to work with professional cyclists, we would always do detailed monitoring. But a few days leading into an important race, if we started seeing data that maybe indicated they weren't ready to go well, we'd work with the coach and he would deliver that information in a more positive manner. So, effectively maybe not tell them the truth about what their data was looking like for the fear that it may lead them to feel bad even if they're not, or it may lead them to having a poor performance even if they themselves were up to having a good performance. I guess the difference now is we don't hide from that data because it's on our wrists. It's in our pockets for all of us. The challenge now is we're overloaded with that data, and potentially it's so much data that we ignore a lot of it anyway and perhaps lose some of the benefit in that way.
And even for some of us, it's in our skin these days as well. It's chip and whatnot, and the degree to which people are tracking their health. And, on one hand, as you said, it's a two-edged sword. It can really be of potential benefit. It could, maybe set an alarm where someone's life is saved, because maybe there's a blocked artery that's about to happen or, something to that effect. And so can that be then forewarned and so forth. So yeah, it's interesting how that's evolving. So suffice to say, it's evolving, it's rapid, as is tech in general. Now, how would then a consumer be really discerning in and around a type of tech that's beneficial for them, let's say from a productivity perspective, as opposed to kind of thinking, well, I might get this heart rate variability app because, it also does this and that, versus, and let's say an app that does kind of everything versus an app that's more focused. Do you have anything, suggestions there for the consumer?
Yeah. So I guess maybe that's a bit of a sideline, and it's like answering the question. What question do you want to answer? Like, it's rather than getting data or getting information and then trying to make something of it, it's like, why do I want to look at this? And maybe that's a bit of a lead into the question of why we set up Pylot initially. So, for me, as I mentioned before, I'm based in New Zealand. I was working for a US tech company remotely. My whole team was remote, but the time zones mean that I'd hop up at 6, 7 o'clock in the morning and have a whole morning of meetings in the US time zone. The US would finish their day at about my midday, and then I'd have my afternoon to do what I call my real work, like get in and do that deep work that I actually needed to do that wasn't just emails and meetings. And quite often I'd find I'm really struggling to get in the groove here, and I'd keep asking myself, am I just being lazy because everybody else has finished up? Or am I actually just fatigued from the 4 hours or 5 hours of meetings I've had in the morning? And then that's when my two worlds of being productivity enthusiast and performance scientist came together to say, well, maybe I can measure that. So to me, that's like asking a question and then seeing if there's data that can actually answer my question. So I guess I'd apply that more broadly when I'm looking at wearables, whether it's in the productivity space or in the health and fitness space, to say, rather than just track everything, be very selective about what you're looking to track based on the information and the questions you want to answer.
Yeah, that's really well said. Yeah, I wanted to really be a bit more broad around this, introducing before we dive specifically into your creation, just because I do believe it's important, given the influx of information and new pieces of tech, that from a wellness, fitness, health perspective, to ask yourself, like you mentioned, like, why would I want this? How would it benefit me? So I think asking those more larger questions allows someone then to have that choice made more kind of focused, rather than, just hitting and missing and then kind of almost wasting time or even money subscribing to some of these pieces of app and therefore maybe being too immersed or overloaded. And I think that's really crucial as well. We've only got finite energy.
I think one of the big ones that's continually stands out to me, coming from a science background, there's a lot of wearable technology that measures things, but their accuracy is very questionable. And especially now, sensors, some of them are more convenient, but less accurate. And it's a bit of a trade-off. And there's some companies that probably put more interest and time into their marketing than they do into the validation of their equipment. And so heart rate variability I always focus on because that's my background, and it's quite common now. Like pretty much every smartwatch will do that with varying degrees of accuracy. But that only gives you the raw data. The next one is, well, how do you use that data? Because me as an individual consumer, I'm not going to, get into, Python or Excel and start analyzing that. So I'm completely reliant on what my wearable or my software is providing back in terms of its analysis. So not only has to be accurate data, but then I need to believe in its opinion and its approach to how it actually analyzes that. And once again, I think the quality of those things varies across wearables. I have a real fascination in this area, and there's definitely better options, but there's also a lot of options out there that I think would probably not be worth their money.
Yeah, so really be informed, that's what you're saying, and obviously have a look at those companies that they've done the actual research, not just invested in large amounts of marketing dollars, but they've invested in the research. There's some degree of validation and also probably to be transparent and say, well, it's actually not 100%. Like, can it really get to that level of being 100% accurate? So what about being honest, right, with how the information comes about?
Yeah, 100% agree. It's like that, even now having created our own wearable, but even prior to that, working on looking at data from many, there's this trade-off between accuracy and ease of use. And you can't get both. So as a user, you need to make that decision, even though the company might be trying to tell you that they're both very high. So, for the likes, for example, I wear a Garmin watch or someone might wear an Apple Watch. The quality of heart rate variability from those devices is far inferior than, say, a heart rate chest strap, which is far less convenient, but far more accurate. So, okay, which do you prefer there? It's not saying that you always have to go for the more accurate option. It's just being aware that by going for the more convenient option, you could well get more data, which becomes more powerful. But sometimes you may need to take that with a grain of salt.
The amount of data versus the accuracy and the ease of use. I love that. It's accuracy versus ease of use.
And definitely when it came to heart rate variability, for us, that was so powerful that doing a manual test with a chest strap on athletes like we did 20 years ago, it's very difficult to get the athletes to comply consistently. Whereas now you could give them a smartwatch and you could get that data, and yes, you lose a bit of accuracy, but they don't actually have to do anything. So suddenly you're getting this data consistently and regularly, which becomes more powerful than the bit of accuracy you lose. So that's not saying that's the right approach. It's just saying that there is that trade-off, and you end up making a decision or making a choice based on which one you think's the right decision for that user.
Well said. And another thing that can be said, from a scientific perspective, is to not interpret a piece of data as a once-off. And as you and I know, you've got to collate that data over a span of time and then interpret it in terms of, I've actually improved in these type of measures. And I think there's something to be said about that. Like that example you said of, let's say someone's just got excited, they've used their sleep tracker, and all of a sudden they're interpreting it from a once-off, whereas it needs to be interpreted over a span of time, tantamount to that being a habit, right? Being inculcated as a habit.
Yeah, that's very true from two parts. Firstly, because the more data it gets, you can establish your baseline for that metric, because everybody's individual baseline for various measures differs. But then also, if you get one erratic day or one erratic night of data, you don't want to overread too much into it, because you want to keep it in perspective of, a longer time frame, which is once again, I guess, the value or the beauty of having convenient data is you're probably going to get daily data. And therefore, if you have one day that's sort of an anomaly, you don't need to overread it, because you've got the last 6 days and you're going to get the next day, and it's going to create an overall picture instead of relying just on one little metric in one day.
There's a little education gap there, I think, for the general population who may not have that scientific background or that sort of degree of analysis type of thinking. Let's shift now into Pylot, and certainly the story behind it, what inspired it, and how do you feel it's going to make the difference in this sort of productivity space?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, we very much went into this not as a business, but really as a project to answer a question, which was, am I lazy or am I mentally fatigued? And because, as somebody who's very productivity conscious, you're always driving yourself. And then when you don't live up to your standard, you start to question yourself. So that was the underlying reason we wanted to look at being able to measure initially mental fatigue. As with any project, scientific or business, it took a whole lot longer and was a whole lot more difficult than I ever expected, and may not have started if I had have known how difficult it was. So it took us a good solid couple of years of just doing trials and capturing data and doing analysis to get to a point where we actually found that there was useful metrics that related mental performance to what we'd call task performance. And I say task performance because we've been talking about productivity, but measuring productivity is next to impossible. So, what we call productivity is often a feeling for us knowledge workers more so than something that's actually measured. So, in terms of our research, we actually had to take a step back and go, well, we're going to do this with competitive gamers who are having to use their mind and, interact with a computer, but there's a clear performance outcome where we're actually able to see what they're doing every second in their game, and we're able to get these various performance metrics throughout the game. So that became the basis of what we'd call task performance, even though we had this goal of being able to relate that to, work productivity or work task performance.
So it was piloted with gamers first, is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So we went through, from a scientific point of view, I guess, interestingly, we read some research, and from that we thought, it's feasible to do what we're doing. The research is a little bit murky in that space. There was lots of research saying you could measure things like mental fatigue, but how it could be done differed quite a lot with the same types of sensors. So, but for us, we were very clear that we wanted consumer grade sensors. We didn't end up wanting, it wasn't a solution or an option for us to sit here with a full skull cap and a 21 lead EEG on our head, because that just wasn't practical to use, which comes back to what I said before about this ease of use versus data accuracy. And sure, a 21 lead EEG is going to be more accurate, but I'm never going to use it. So therefore, it's completely ineffective in answering my question. So we focused on what we call consumer grade sensors, which, is similar to what you would get in a watch, for heart rate variability. And we focused on two types of sensors. We focused on EEG, which is measuring brainwave activity, and we focused on heart rate variability because there was some research that was able to link heart rate variability change to mental fatigue. And then we went through these trials where we basically did this what we call a torture test, like a repetitive mental challenge on, we had about 100 subjects. It was very torturous to do, and It was but very valuable in terms of the data we got, basically because we were doing a repeated mental challenge every 15 seconds for an hour with the pure aim of trying to get the individual mentally fatigued, to see what changes there were in those sensor data and also what changes there were in the performance results that they were getting. Once we used that data to establish some metrics, then we applied that data in a more real life situation and went out to competitive gamers who we gave sensors to use at their home, where they were, these were hardcore gamers, some of them were playing 6 or 7 hours a day, and their goal was not playing for fun, but playing because they wanted to perform well. And then looking at those metrics we'd established in a controlled environment and see, could we validate those in more of a real life environment? So, as an example, with this mental fatigue metric, if someone played for 7 hours of back-to-back games, were we seeing what we would expect there? Were the performance results in the game reflective of what we were getting in our controlled setting, etc.? So that's sort of how we went from more of controlled trials to validation trials. And we end up with, many thousands of hours of this data and probably more than many thousands of hours analysing that data to get to a point where we felt we had something useful.
Yeah, I can see how this could be a real game changer in the corporate space. Yeah, like if you think of, in the corporate space, it's quite competitive, let's say, and they have to hit their KPIs, their metrics, but are they actually working in the correct zone, and maybe you want to touch on this in a moment and why EEG monitoring is so important to this. But you and I had a chat the other day and we talked about the alpha, beta. So I want to touch on that and why that brainwave tracking is so important. And also then what is Pylot actually measuring and how does it work? What's it really measuring? And what is the ideal zone that one kind of needs to get into to work at that, focus level, for example?
So I guess we went into our research with some assumptions on what we would expect to see. And we focused on using two types of sensors, which I've mentioned, which is EEG, which is tracking brainwave activity, and heart rate variability from a partial mental fatigue point of view. The EEG is an interesting one because there's a lot of research in this area, but it's very conflicting. And that was really challenging because a lot of especially from a mental fatigue point of view, a lot of the research is focused on repetitive challenges that perhaps don't have much purpose, like mathematical challenges. And we were seeing quite different results to what these repeated mathematical challenges were doing. And it wasn't until we found this research that was on pilots, why they were actually flying a plane, where we're like, that's what we're seeing. We're actually, the majority of our subjects who are more engaged in the trials and actually are wanting to perform are pushing themselves and getting fatigued, as opposed to these people who were doing a repeated mathematical challenge who were perhaps getting to the point where it got tough and boring and just tuned out and just went into semi-sleep mode. But there was we settled on, or we established a range of metrics, and we really expected from an EEG point of view that beta activity, which is associated with focus and intense attention, would correlate or relate to task performance. And once we started looking at the gamers' results, we actually found the inverse. We found that when this beta activity went up, then their game performance was actually declining. And that was really surprising to us. But what we did find is when alpha activity was higher, then their game performance was much higher. We're like, that's not expected, and that's really interesting. And I perhaps simplify it when I say alpha and beta. The equation that analyzes that is slightly more complicated than that, but let's just call it alpha and beta. But then when we went through and started looking at some of the published research in this space on flow state and task performance, it was all referring to this same phenomenon, which was largely around alpha activity. And that's what the researchers would term flow state, being associated with optimal task performance, whether it was something more creative or whether it was something more logical like a mathematical challenge. So from a scientific point of view, I was very opposed to the term flow for quite a while. But in the end, that's, from a product point of view, that's what we've settled on for that word is flow, because it was referred commonly throughout the scientific research for alpha or high alpha brainwave activity, but it was also commonly associated by the general user. So that was a really surprising outcome for us, to the point that, you can focus intensely and get beta activity and actually have reduced task performance. Whereas if you're in this more flow state, which I guess I'd best describe it as relaxed concentration, where yes, you're fully absorbed in what you're doing, but you're not intense about it. It's there and you're taking it all in, but you're very relaxed and you're just, once again, in the zone, or using the that type of phrase, as opposed to the focus or the beta attention, which is very intense and very narrow. So that was a really surprising outcome for us. And, that's what we saw in our initial trials. And then that's also what we validated on the real life gamers. So, that's sort of where we settled on these two key metrics of flow and mental fatigue, whereby effectively the more time you spend in a high flow zone, then the higher the task performance. And mental fatigue was probably less impactful on task performance, with the exception of when it got very high. When mental fatigue got high, then task performance started to decline quite quickly. Whereas when mental fatigue was low or moderate up to a certain level, it sort of didn't matter too much.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, remarkable. And how do you see this sort of playing out more sort of generally, let's say in the corporate space, in the workspace, in whether it's that or let's say an artist or someone in the creatives? How does this actually work optimally for that person? Because in a work environment, like, it's quite generic, right? Everyone's potentially 9 to 5, although that sort of mindset's changing, it's still quite prevalent. Like, we need to work 8-9 hours a day. So how do you think this will kind of shift those entrenched beliefs and ways of operating in society?
Yeah. So I guess before directly answering that, I think it's a matter of stepping back and going, well, what are we trying to maximize or optimize here? And our vision was always, we're not trying to optimize output. So the word productivity is a little bit misleading because it's basically your output during time, right? What we're really trying to help users or individuals achieve is to optimize their time. So why sit here at the desk and try and do my best work when mentally I'm not going to achieve my best work? And, it comes back to the same as what we might think about from an athletic point of view. Why go and try and run a PB if physically I'm fatigued or physically I'm not sharp and I'm not in the condition to do that? So by helping people make better choices, can we help them target their appropriate task for the time that they're ready to do that task? So if I'm sitting here and I'm ready to go, great, give me that deep work task, I get into it and I'm going to do really well. But if I'm not, and maybe I need to get away, go for a walk, have lunch, have a break, whatever, or at the very least, look at doing some more administrative tasks such as, email or something process driven. So I think, when we started presenting Pylot and the concept of Pylot to users and potential users, there was a lot of interest, but we also very quickly got some pushback from people saying, well, why do I want people to monitor my brain, to know what I'm thinking and to try and push me to achieve more? It's just like a corporate overlord. And for us, it was the complete opposite. We look at the data, and depending on what source you look at, you can basically assume that the average worker spends 2 to 3 hours of deep work, doing deep work a day. But yet it takes us 8 or 9 hours to achieve that. So that seems very wasteful for us to do 2 to 3 hours of important stuff, but spread it across the whole day. So can we help people get more out of their time by knowing when they should be doing that 2 to 3 hours and doing it at their best so that they can then do other things during the other parts of their day? So that was always our goal. I guess what we've found is some really interesting questions. There's a lot of people who control their time from a work point of view and are able to have the flexibility and autonomy to adjust their day. And Pylot's very well suited for them at the moment because they can pick it up, they can learn, they can take this information on, they can adjust, and they can get the outcome that they're after. From a more corporate or structured point of view, it becomes interesting in other ways, such as, well, if you're in a small team and, it's knowledge work, what happens if half the team is morning people, so to speak, where their flow levels are highest in the morning, and the other half don't hit that until 4 or 5 in the afternoon? Is that your ideal team? Or do you need to restructure how things are done? And what happens if you always have a meeting from 9 till 10 each morning to do a stand-up meeting, and you're eating into half the team's prime hours for the day? Is that the best use of their time? So it allows you to start looking at things in a different way, even though there may be less flexibility in individual time schedules.
Yeah, so more of a fluid and agile kind of work environment. That's, I suppose, how it could potentially shift in a corporate setting.
Yeah, for us, I guess the ultimate is giving people the responsibility to, because most people want to do their best work at work, right? So very few people are rocking up just to fill in the time. So if you're wanting to do your best work, give people the autonomy and the flexibility to do their best work and let them learn about themselves so that they can monitor their mental energy and then accommodate their schedule to match their mental energy profiles. So that's what we'd highly encourage, because we believe that at the very least, they're going to get that 2 or 3 hours of deep work in less time. But potentially they get a little bit more deep work in the same amount of time. And either outcome there is a win for the individual and for the organisation.
Yeah, most definitely. It really backs the self-determination theory as well. And one of those key elements is autonomy. So plenty of research done in that space, as well as we've touched on Flow and Mahali Csikszentmihalyi and his pivotal work, which is somewhat validated now with the tech and in particular what you and your team's doing. How do you see, what would be one of the obstacles, I suppose, with Pylot perhaps being an uptake of Pylot, and secondly, the scalability of it?
Yeah, I think there's two here. So the first one is our early users are tech-savvy people who control their personal work schedules for the reasons that we just discussed. And they're generally tech-savvy because for an EEG, we unfortunately at the moment need to be on the head. So wear a headband. It doesn't weigh much. It's comfortable to wear, but it looks a little bit different. So, you and I are sitting here at the moment with headphones on and they're these massive big cushions over our ears, but that's accepted because we're all used to that. Where it's not so acceptable that people wear a headband in the workplace. So if you're working at home, then that's fine. But there's definitely a barrier in terms of the current form factor, in terms of making that bigger. And I think in terms of the corporate environment, it's got a few other challenges, because if your employer's encouraging this, then some people are very suspicious of maybe what EEG can do. And like I mentioned before, we definitely have had feedback saying, well, we don't want our employer to be reading our thoughts. And even though that's nothing that EEG is capable of doing, there's that underlying suspicion. So I think from a corporate point of view, that's the challenge. So I think the two barriers, the form factor, and then, getting the confidence from users that it's in their benefit as much as in their employer's benefit.
Or you could do it like a Pat Cash or Bjorn Borg style, where it kind of looks like they're, they rack it up and they're ready to get productive or anti-productive maybe. But I suppose one of those things there, have you looked at education and tutorials to kind of educate not just a user, but let's say the manager, who's maybe skeptical or, what is this? And they're unsure. So how's that come along?
Yeah, we actually haven't got to that point as yet. So we're early days. We're currently shipping out to pre-order customers. The majority of those pre-order customers are individuals. And so we're not at that, I guess, in terms of our business approach, we're wanting to learn as much as possible from the early users before then trying to go down more of the business-to-business path, where we know the barrier to entry is going to be a bit more challenging and the education's going to be more. At the same time, I guess some of the big learnings for us in that space have been that areas of interest are not just what we had expected. So, I mentioned that we focused this on productivity because it was trying to answer my initial problem or my initial question. And there's an obvious link to that and corporate workplace. But then we've had a lot of interest from people who have ADHD and are trying to manage mental performance around those challenges. Or we've had it from sort of specialist industries, say, like a Department of Defence, who might be looking at monitoring, training, say, for pilots or for other sort of new skills. So there's a whole range of these other areas that we never would have thought of, but the product's equally applicable to, that we're learning from. So the reality is we haven't got to the B2B or overcoming the B2B obstacles because we're still learning a whole heap at this point in time.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to mine. I've shipped my order in and I'll definitely be looking forward to putting that on my head and seeing what my brainwaves are up to. And so just a side note, in the show notes, those listeners, you'll be able to click the link, trypylot.com, and then be able to purchase at quite a discounted rate, I believe, Ben, at the moment. So yeah, there's that just for those who are keenly interested, which certainly I'd like to lead by example, and I'm going to be trying mine. By the way, you mentioned that you were inspired by pilots. Is that where the name has come from, Pylot?
unrelated to the research I referenced, but yes, we were basically looking for a name. We thought, well, this is nice and short, and it's, the word Pylot indicates to guide and take you somewhere. So, but we're Pylot with a Y because Pylot with an I was sort of everywhere else. So, getting a company name is always very difficult.
I like it. It's a very good play on words. So is there anything else you'd like to share with the listener just in regards to, what we've spoken about thus far? We've touched on quite a few interesting concepts around maybe challenging the notion of productivity and that constantly I need to get shit done, for lack of a better term, and this kind of obsession about kind of maximizing, every single minute to get outputs. So is there anything that you might want to sort of just add as a more of a point of advice or,
Yeah, so I think you and I were chatting before the podcast, and we were talking about that maybe in our earlier days we were very focused on maximising every minute, whereas now we're probably a bit more relaxed, that we're a bit older, potentially more sensible. But I think that to me, it's about maximising your energy, to use your mental energy for the things that are important to you. And some days that's work. You hop up on a work day and you've got this big important task, then your priority that day is work. But other days it's not. Other days it might be, family or sport or something else that's not related to work. And being able to use your mental energy in those areas of priority are important to you. So to me, it's getting away from this maximising time and trying to grind out more tasks and really trying to maximise your mental energy and use your time in areas that are rewarding for you.
It's beautifully summed up, and it does remind me as well, and it invokes a sense of being present. So the idea is that when you're more in flow, you're more present to the activity, whether that's work a solo or with a team or with family or friends. And I think that's an important thing, Ben, in society today, where we're constantly projecting and looking to the next thing and piling more and more stuff. But whereas I think this allows us to shift is just really focus in on being present and doing our best work in that moment versus not being distracted.
100% agree. And whether, as you said, whether that's work or whether it's spending time with family and being fully engaged with that. And it's a real challenge now, right? We all have these little distractions in our pocket that we feel a habit of needing to look at. And whether you're with family and that's getting in the way of that quality time, or whether you're at work and trying to achieve those key tasks, and you have this desire to keep looking at your phone, really trying to get away from that is important. And I guess that, for us at Pylot, we're trying to monitor information to give you feedback to help you make better decisions. We're definitely not making the decisions for you. We're definitely not, stimulating your brain or doing any of these things. It's really trying to give you information to make better decisions, to therefore, get a more reward out of the time you spend.
Yeah, it's wonderfully summed up. If you could change one thing about, let's say, in your space that in the health or medical industry today, or at large even beyond that, what would that be?
I think the big one that stands out to me is that there's always this super easy solution, or there's this secret exercise, or there's this, great specific training zone if you just do this, or there's this special protocol, you just do this and life will be great. I think life's simpler than that, but it's also harder, and it's just a matter of doing the right things, making the right choices consistently over a long period of time. So to me, that's the real frustration I have in the health and fitness and medical space, is everyone always looking for shortcuts and some special solution to a problem that just requires consistency and hard work.
Yeah, I always think of like being more of the alchemist and creating your own silver bullet versus just chasing it, And I think that's really true. And I've had that in moments too, where I was chasing something, but in fact, I really needed to look within, know that the resources were actually within me, and get really focused, and rather than, trying to overdo it at times.
Yeah, I think we all want the simple solution, right? It'd be great if we could take a pill, flick a switch, and it just worked. But those promises, I think, are never reality, unfortunately.
Oh, this has been a tremendous conversation. Ben, I'm hoping we can have you back at some point down the track, and really look forward to seeing how Pylot rolls out in wider society. A lot of really good nuggets out of this conversation. So for the listeners, the show notes will recap all of the great insights that Ben shared, and you can certainly follow Ben through the website, and anything else that Ben will share will be in those show notes. And so do check out the product, at least check the website at the very least. So Ben, thank you for your time. It's been really an absorbing conversation, and we're wishing you the best with the rollout of Pylot.
All right, thank you very much for the time. Enjoyed the chat.
Thank you for being a part of our podcast community. We work hard to create content that we hope you enjoy and find valuable. If you haven't already, we would be honoured if you would consider subscribing and following us on your favourite platform. That way, you'll never miss an episode and you'll always be the first to know when new episodes are released. We truly appreciate your support and we can't wait to continue to grow and connect with you through our podcast.